Hi friends, this is Talking Heads of Atascocita. I am Amy Bridwell, and I have the displeasure of talking to a photo of Msgr James Golasinski today, but the show is going to go on because today is a very, very important day. June 25th, 1950, Communist North Korea invaded South Korea. So Msgr is going to give us some eyewitness accounts and some details about what's commonly called the Forgotten War, the Korean War. But before we do all that, Msgr, would you like to pray?
All right, let us begin. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
And direct us, O Lord, in all our actions, that every work and prayer may begin with Thee, and so that it be successfully completed through Christ our Lord.
Amen.
In the name of the Father, of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Well, this day I remember very, very well. And I am going to tell a story of the only military chaplain ever to receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. But before I get to him, his name is Father Venerable Emil Kaplan. That's a Czech name. He was born in a little town of Pilsen, not far from Wichita, Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
And those Texans who are listening are familiar with the painted churches that we have west here, all those little Czech and German churches.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I got the impression that his home parish, St. John, there in Pilsen, is very much like those little painted churches we're so proud of here in Texas.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, before I get into his story, I want to give a background as to why there was a war in Korea.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned the Forgotten War. Well, day before yesterday, I was out in front doing a little work in the yard, and a neighbor passed by. We chat from time to time. She lives a few blocks away, and she's about 50 years old, born in New Orleans, works for a chemical company. Here during the virus, she's been working at home. And she has a neighbor who has a dog. If the neighbor is in poor health, so every day she walks the dog here in the neighborhood.
That's good. That's nice.
And we become acquainted. And yesterday she asked me, what book was I reading? And I told her, well, I'm reading a book about a priest who was a chaplain during the Korean War who has received posthumously the Congressional Medal of Honor. And as I was speaking these words, I could see the Migo effect.
Migo.
You know what the Migo effect is?
I don't know what the Migo effect is.
It's an acronym, MEGOW.
Okay.
My eyes glaze over. Because I could see just lack of comprehension in her eyes.
Yep.
And I said, you do know about the Korean War, don't you? She said, well, you know what that means, huh? Now, I really wasn't all that surprised. Because when I was in Spring Branch at St. Andrew Kim Parish, the Korean language parish, there was a neighbor lived across the back fence, side fence from the church, who was a parishioner at, what's the parish there in Spring Branch?
I do not know.
I'm having a real problem with names, remembering names today. Anyway, it was shortly after Reagan became president, and we had a problem with balance of trade. Remember, he succeeded Carter when he took office.
Yeah.
We were having 20%. I mean, crime rate was 20%.
That is hard to believe.
Double-digit inflation, double-digit this, double-digit that. And one of the things that he did was he tried to deal with the balance of trade problem with Japan. We were buying all that cheap electronic stuff from Japan. And she told me that her son, who was, I think, a sophomore at the University of Houston at the time, was complaining. Asking, where did he get the authority, to put this extra tariff?
Yeah.
He was young, and he liked buying cheap electronic stuff from Japan.
Yeah.
And then she proceeded to tell me that she said to him, well, I guess it doesn't bother us, my generation, not our generation, like you, because of the war with Japan. And he said, we had a war with Japan. It gets better. Now, this is a product of the famous Spring Branch School District. And the next question was even better. He then said to his mother, who won?
Oh, my goodness.
Yeah. Well, anyway, how did this all begin? Well, in 1910, Japan began its expansion onto the Asian mainland. Korea was like a bridge between Japan and the Asian mainland. And the occupation was complete in the year 1910. And then after that, they then expanded north. Korea was a kingdom. In fact, I once met the queen, the last Korean queen.
Oh my goodness.
When I was in Korea. But anyway, and then they expanded into Manchuria. Manchuria was an underdeveloped portion of China, and they occupied Manchuria. And they set up a puppet kingdom there. Did you ever see that movie, The Last Chinese Emperor?
I did not.
Yeah, well, that was about this period.
Okay.
And then they invaded northern China. They kept expanding. Kept expanding.
Right.
Well, anyway, then came World War II. And World War II came to a sudden end. On August the 9th, 3 days after the dropping of the bomb on Hiroshima, and the day before it was dropped on Nagasaki, on August the 9th, Russia started its attack upon Japan. There was an agreement between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin that 90 days after the surrender of Germany, that Russia would then invade Japan, which they did do. 90 days to the day. It took time, to move forces from Europe there to the Far East. And anyway, they invaded Manchuria, and then very quickly Japan surrendered. And there was a question there. There was this army, the Japanese army, in Korea and in Manchuria. It was big. It's called the Kwangdong Army. It had about 750,000 men.
That is big.
When I was in Korea, I knew Koreans who had been in the Japanese army.
Oh my goodness.
One of my close friends, Father Gregory Pak, his parish is next to mine. He'd been in the Japanese army during World War II. Koreans served in the Japanese army during World War II. And anyway, there were many Japanese civilians who had migrated to Korea and to Manchuria. A lot of Koreans had migrated to Manchuria also. I had two catechists when I was in Korea, in Pusan, who were born in Manchuria. And so what happened was they had to be a decision what to do about this part of the Far East. And anyway, there were two men. One name was Dean Rusk. He was a colonel in the army. The other was named Charles Bone Steele. He was another. He was commander of the UN forces when I arrived in Korea in 1967. He had a patch on one eye. His nickname was One-Eyed Charlie. They were given the job of deciding where to divide the Korean Peninsula for us to occupy and for the Russians to occupy, to then deal with these Japanese military and civilians. And Dean Rusk, who was later Secretary of State, remember? And Charles Bone Steele, they looked at the map and they saw the 38th parallel was about midway down, in the Korean Peninsula. And the old historic capital, Seoul, was a little bit south of that. So they proposed the 38th parallel.
Okay.
And the Russians agreed. And what was supposed to happen was we were supposed to take all the Japanese back to Japan, and military and civilians, and then bring Koreans who had gone to Japan, because there were a lot of Koreans who had gone to Japan.
Right.
In fact, I got to the point where I could recognize them because they had a little bit of a Japanese accent. But anyway, St. Jerome Parish, that's the name of the parish in Spring Branch. Before I went to Korea, I met a layman from there, and he was in the Navy, and he described being on a ship that was involved in the repatriation of the Japanese back to Japan, and then bringing Koreans back to Korea. Well, what the Russians did was they sent them off to Siberia, and they used them for slave labor for a long time.
Yeah.
And then eventually, they sent them back, repatriated them back to Japan. And when the Russians occupied the northern half of Korea, the north of the 30th parallel, they brought in Kim Il-sung, grandfather of the notorious Kim Jong-un, who now is the strong man of North Korea. And they installed him there in North Korea. Just like at the end of World War II in Europe, they took people in and they installed them in power in all those countries. All those countries like Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria and Poland and East Germany, they installed their men. And they did the same thing in North Korea. And the UN got into the picture. Now, this is something a lot of there's a great deal of ignorance about. In fact, past couple of days I've gotten on the internet and read about what's there, the origin of the war in Korea and so forth. And the UN gets mentioned very, very little. And but like one case, there was a question, why did the United States get involved in the Korean War? And the answer was, well, Harry Truman was worried over a domino effect. See, the Chinese communists, Mao Tse-tung's Chinese communists, had just triumphed in the Civil War in China in 1949.
Right.
And here we have the next year. And they said that President Truman, was concerned of a domino effect, that if they took over all of Korea, then Japan would be next.
That's right.
Don't say that's right.
Well, that's what I've read. So honestly, that's the story I've heard for a long time. So, okay, I'll say this. That's not right.
Japan is an island nation, right?
Yes, that's right.
Four main islands. If you're going to invade, don't you have to have a navy?
Yeah, that would be helpful.
Did the Chinese communists have a navy?
Nope.
Did the Russians have a Pacific fleet?
No, they didn't. Nope.
So you see how ridiculous it is?
Yeah.
And the person who wrote that apparently was trying to set it up as capitalism versus communism.
Oh, that makes
because
sense.
It went on to say that Truman wanted Japan to be an economic partner or something of that sort. And there's no mention whatever of the UN. Now, what was the UN about? Well, after World War I, the League of Nations was established. It was to try to prevent war again, like the first. Remember they called World War I the Great War. And anyway, the League of Nations was established. We didn't join it. Our Congress refused to go along with Wilson's idealism, and Russia which had just the communists had just taken over Russia. They didn't join the UN. I mean, the League of Nations. And it became weaker and weaker. And then in the 1930s, Mussolini, who was trying to restore the ancient Roman Empire, invaded Abyssinia, now known as Ethiopia. And their king was Haile Selassie. And he appealed to the UN for protection against the Italian invasion. And he got no help. And that really was the nail in the coffin of the League of Nations. Well, before World War II ended, then we have this idea of having another organization called the UN. The organization, the meeting that organized it took place in the spring of '45 in San Francisco, and then the Rockefellers, I think, gave land, and the UN headquarters was built there in New York, and on and on. Well, the first Secretary General of the UN was a Norwegian. His name was Trygve, and he was apparently a devout Lutheran. And pay attention to this expression: collective security.
Collective security.
You know, with the UN now, we got all this other stuff. We got the World Health Organization, which has been in the news and so forth. But the point in 1945 for the beginning of the UN was collective security. You see, Germany was a nation, 70 million or something like that? The people of Denmark went to sleep in the spring of 1940, and they woke up the next morning part of the Third Reich. The German army had occupied little Denmark overnight. It took them 2 weeks to subjugate Norway. Norway, I think, was about 4 million people. And so these little countries, they wanted collective security, namely that if one was invaded by another, was a victim of unjust aggression, all the other
would rally around.
To its rescue. Well, that morning, June 25th, the North Koreans invaded South Korea. South Korea was a little country. And North Korea was powerful. MacArthur was in charge of the defense of the Far East. His headquarters in Tokyo. General Douglas MacArthur. And the North Korean army had been outfitted by Stalin. They had 300 T-34 tanks, arguably the best tank at the beginning of World War II. They had an air force. South Korea had no air force, had no anti-tank weapons. In fact, South Korean soldiers were running up against T-34 tanks with satchel charges. You know what a satchel charge is?
No.
It's like a book satchel full of explosives.
Oh my goodness.
And these brave South Korean soldiers, they were running up against these T-34 tanks and blowing themselves up trying to disable the tanks. I could go on and on. And it's really, but anyway, it's very, very, very uneven. And so by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Trygve, who was in New York at UN headquarters, had called a meeting of the UN. There was a crisis. And so what happened was, there was a resolution for the UN to go to South Korea. Collective security, remember?
Yes.
And we, of course, had the strong forces. And Truman then made MacArthur the head of the UN forces. And he quickly sent some troops. Sent some troops to South Korea, and it was horrible. They were so overmatched. And the invading North Korean army had about 90,000 men. About 1/3 of those were battle-tested guys who had been in China, part of Mao Zedong's Chinese Communist Army, in their civil war. And after that ended, Kim Il-sung said, "Send my boys back." So I've read that about 1/3 of the North Korean army were these hardened veterans. And anyway, these fellows that were rushed, that MacArthur rushed there, I mean, it was horrible. They were just overrun. And what happened was the North Korean army kept pushing south, until finally there was just this southeastern section of South Korea, in which Pusan was the center. And it was kind of miraculous, because the North Koreans had sent a naval force that was supposed to land and take Pusan.
Oh my goodness.
Because Pusan would be a source of supply. And what happened was, by accident, some South Korean naval vessel bumped into this force in the Sea of Japan, and those and the North Korean naval forces turned around.
Oh.
If that accident had not taken place, the North Koreans would have taken the city and the port of Pusan, which is a great port city.
Yes, it is. Fourth? Do you say the fourth largest in the world?
It's one of the largest, one of the largest in the world. But anyway, so the South Korean forces, plus the men that we started sending through Pusan, were pushed into this northeastern section. The western edge was pretty much the Naktung River. I'm talking about the Pusan perimeter. On my mountain where I was, I could go up and I could look off in the distance and I could see the Naktung River.
Oh my goodness! What a view!
Just before it flowed into the Sea of Japan. And anyway, in July, Father Admiral Kapan, Venerable Admiral Kapan, was in Japan at that time.
Oh, okay.
He was an Army chaplain.
Oh, that's why. Okay.
Right. He was with the 1st Cavalry Division.
Okay.
And he was a chaplain for the 8th Regiment.
Okay.
And there were three battalions. And that was the first place where he was involved in the war. And he won a Bronze Star. And what happened was they learned that there was this American officer who was wounded deep in North Korean occupied territory. And he and took one or two other people, and they went deep into North Korean occupied territory and rescued this man and another that was there that was even not known about. And for that, he received
the Bronze Star. Brave man.
Well, what happened was, beginning of September, MacArthur sent the 1st Marine Division into the Yellow Sea and attacked Incheon, which is the port city for the capital Seoul, behind the North Korean lines. And that broke the back of the North Korean army.
Okay.
And simultaneously, our forces, which had been built up inside the Pusan perimeter, they attacked from the south.
Yeah, and they were able to push them back. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
They crossed the 38th parallel. By the way, when I was in Korea, I heard many interesting stories. Like a good friend of mine, a Columban priest. There were Columban priests who were in North Korea.
Wow.
No, who were near North Korea. Near North Korea.
Okay.
And they came close to being captured. In fact, some of them were.
Yeah.
Some of them died in captivity. But anyway, when you get into October and then close to November, we're all the way, up close to the Manchurian border. And what happened was after the 1st Marine Division had taken Incheon, they was loaded on ships and taken around into the Sea of Japan and landed on the coast of east coast of North Korea. So you had the 1st Marine Division mainly on the eastern side of the mountain range that flows from north to south on the Korean Peninsula. There was one regiment of the 7th Division. And the U.S. 8th Army was on the west side of the mountain range. And MacArthur's people in Japan kept telling them, go, 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 go. And the Marines were commanded by a man named General Oliver Smith. He was a native of East Texas. He was a soft-spoken, very, very methodical type of individual. There was a movie made about the 1st Marine Division being attacked in North Korea. It's called Retreat Hell. Frank Lovejoy, who has sort of a hard-nosed guy, he plays the role of General Oliver Smith. The personalities couldn't have been more different.
Oh my goodness.
But anyway, the Marines were much, much more prepared because he was smelling a rat. He was seeing danger, and so he was being very, very careful. Whereas the U.S. 8th Army over on the west side, they were going helter-skelter.
It was blowing and going.
The Manchurian border.
Right.
And the 1st Marines, they got jumped They're about 25,000. They got jumped by about 125,000 Chinese.
Oh, man.
Yeah, they fought their way. They fought their way back to the coast, and it's interesting. In their wake came thousands and thousands of North Koreans. They wanted out of North Korea, and after the Navy, I can't remember whether it's Hungnam or Wonsan, the two big ports on the east coast of North Korea. Our Navy, evacuated the people, and once the troops all on board, they told these North Koreans, anybody who wants on, come on. And so they got aboard these ships, and there was one cargo ship, and there were about 14,000 North Koreans who got on that ship. 14,000.
Tells you a lot about life in North Korea, doesn't it?
And this was in late December, and the weather was terrible. And then they headed south, and they came to the city of Pusan on Christmas Day. They were not allowed to unload there. They were sent to another smaller island off the coast.
Okay.
They were in a cargo ship.
Yeah.
And winter. Many of them were on deck, and not one person died. In fact, there was an increase of 6.
Oh, that's miraculous. Oh, my goodness.
There were 6 babies born.
In dead of winter, exposed to all the elements. Wow.
Well, it's interesting. I heard about this from this woman in her 30s. The first summer I was in Korea. I spent time away from language school getting some experience in a Korean parish in the summer of '68, and one of the parishioners there was a North Korean who was on that ship.
Oh, my goodness.
And she told me about it. And she told me that the captain later became a monk.
Oh.
The captain was a Catholic. And in the year 2000, there was a book published commemorating that. And it told about how after the war, after he left the Navy, he entered the Benedictine Monastery in Union City, New Jersey. They gave him the name Marinus.
That's
he didn't become a
appropriate.
priest. He remained a brother.
Okay. Do you remember the name of the book?
I can't remember.
Oh, I'll Google it. Hopefully we can find it.
But one of the things was interesting. She told me, there were Russian troops. The Russians occupied North Korea until August of 1948.
Okay.
The UN had told the U.S., there was a UN commission that was supposed to supervise elections to unify the country, and the Russians never would cooperate. And so what we did was, under the authority of the UN, had elections that were south of the 38th parallel. And the UN recognized that government as the government of Korea.
Okay.
And anyway, she had been there those 3 years in North Korea when the Russians were there. You know what she told me? She told me the whole time she cut her hair to look like a boy. She wore nothing but boys' clothes. I can't remember whether it was between the ages of 12 and 15 or 15 and 18. I don't remember which. But that's how much she was afraid of the Russian troops.
Yeah. I don't blame her. I'm going to be perfectly honest. I don't blame her a bit.
Well, you heard what happened when the Russians came into East Germany.
That's right.
40,
that was my very first thought. The way they treated. Yes.
Well, it was the same experience. And it was interesting too. I had a parishioner, St. Andrew Kim Parish, who was a North Korean. He escaped during the Korean War. He told me about the Russian soldiers coming, to liberate these Koreans who had been oppressed by these capitalist Japanese. And they found that the standard of living in North Korea was higher than back home. You know what he told me? He told me the Russian soldiers loved wristwatches. And he told me, he said, you'd see a Russian soldier have 2 and 3 watches on both arms. They take them off the Korean.
Right.
The Korean civilians. He said, I saw him with my own eyes.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, let me get my thread back. Now, why was we were so unprepared for all this? And for some reason, Dean Acheson, who was Secretary of State under Truman, had given a speech in which he said, our defensive position in East Asia started with our Aleutian Islands, from Alaska, Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines. Well, that put the Korean Peninsula outside. See, outside. And MacArthur had given a speech too. I found this in a history book, and he'd given the same geography, only starting the opposite way. I think he started Philippines, Taiwan, Japan, and Aleutian. So it had been publicized by our Secretary of State and by our military commander in Tokyo that we weren't concerned about what would happen in Korea. And so Stalin took that as a green light.
Yeah.
And as I said, and MacArthur had not equipped the South Korean army. I mean, they had no heavy weapons in it. It was just terrible. So I think I've given the background for all this. I'm trying to remember if there's anything else about the politics of it all. As I mentioned, one of the things that was bad about the Japanese occupation of Korea was they took Korean young women and they spread them throughout their bases in the Pacific, and they had brothels on the military bases throughout the Pacific. They took Koreans, Chinese, and Filipinos. And also, I only learned this not too long ago, even Dutch women who had been captured in the Dutch East Indies, aka Indonesia. If you'd like any information about it, there's one, her name is Jan Ruff, R-U-F-F O'Hearn. And she was about a 20-year-old Dutch woman, and she was used, and they called them comfort girls. Japanese, that was the expression, comfort girls.
Yeah, you loaned me that book.
Oh, I did?
You sure did. Yeah, it was hard to read. It was very hard to read.
I wonder where it is now.
I'll never tell.
Anybody wants to know about her, just look her up on the internet. Jan, J-A-N, R-U-F-F. Ruff is her maiden name, and O'Hearn is her married name. Now, I had first heard about Venerable Amble Capon through a book I received as a ordination gift. A priest from the Austin Diocese who was 1 year ahead of me. He gave me the first book about him. He was a delayed vocation. He came to the seminary after World War II. He dropped out of high school.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. No, I'm talking about this friend.
Oh, okay. Now, Father Cathan.
High school, went to the military, and then afterwards he wanted to be a priest, so he went back to high school, graduated from Lanieri High School.
I love that.
And then came to the seminary.
Okay.
And I never. He gave me the gift. It was wrapped up, and I never saw him again after my ordination. And so I never had a chance to ask him if he had known Venerable Amble Capon when he was in the military. But that's how I first learned about this wonderful priest. Now, to go back to that morning, I said St. Joseph Church. Well, you see, after World War II, we demobilized when the Russians expanded. And then came the Berlin airlift. And then came the triumph of the triumph of the communists in China, and we became aware that we were in what we came to call the Cold War. And fellas who had been in the service during World War II, they weren't interested in being in the reserves. So what the military started doing was recruiting in the high schools. And we had a Marine Reserve unit here in Houston. It's called the San Jacinto Battalion.
Okay.
And a bunch of my classmates, people from the class ahead of me, class of 50, and then my class, we were only juniors. In the spring of 1950, they enlisted in the Marine Reserves. Now, I wasn't old enough. Besides, I was playing American Legion baseball, and we thought we had a good chance of going far. In fact, we lost in the state finals.
Oh, man.
And I was still only 16. And this one classmate, Tommy McWilliams, we were teammates on the St. Thomas High School basketball team. He was a starting forward in our junior year, and he was trying to talk me into it, lying to get in. I mean, there was one fellow here behind me. He was only 15, and he was in the Marine Reserves. And you say, once every 2 weeks you have drill, and you get paid for it. And in the summertime, guess what? California. Summer camp was California. I never crossed the state line. Kids today, they go all over the world by that time. And you talk about bait. California, and you get paid?
Yeah.
And so lots and lots of youngsters. And there's not just only the Marines, but also Army Reserve, Air Force Reserve. When we came back to school in September 1950, well, let me say this. We finished our junior year at St. Thomas with 5 homerooms. When we came back in September, we were down to 4.
Oh, man.
Not all of these. Some of them had gone to public school. But we had a substantial number. And lots and lots of them. And the unit was activated and left Houston on the Feast of the Assumption, August 15th. Southern Pacific Railroad. And years later, I met this man who had been the Marine commander in Galveston County. And we were talking, and he told me about how he had brought his boys up by train from Galveston, and then they had switched the coach from Union Station over to the SP station, the Southern Pacific station, and added it on. And then we headed west. And they stopped, I guess, in San Antonio and added more cars. Now, these are 17, 18, 19-year-old boys for the most part. And anyway, they had boot camp and had a furlough in October, and it looked like the war was about over. MacArthur was talking about bringing the boys home by Christmas. And then they went then for advanced training and had another furlough in December. Things had gone bad. And then they went back, and they were in combat in January. One classmate, Frank Peary, who was a nephew of Father Paul Peary, founder of St. Rose Parish, his uncle, Father Paul Peary, was a Navy chaplain in World War II, and then got called back in the Korean War. Anyway, Frank went to his uncle the day after the North Koreans invaded and said, "What did I do?" His uncle said, "Well, you're going to have to go. What I would recommend is that you enlist in the regular Marines right now. You'll get better training," which he did do, and he made it a career. Retired as a lieutenant colonel. He'd become an Air Force carrier pilot during the Vietnam War. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross. Yeah, and he came to our 50th reunion in 2001, and I asked him, when did you receive, 2011. I asked him, I said, when did you receive your first Purple Heart? Because I knew he'd received 3.
Oh, my goodness. What a man. What a
And
man.
he thought for a minute, and he said, it was in February. So we had classmates who were receiving Purple Hearts before the rest of us got our high school diplomas.
Yeah, that is wild. Oh, my goodness.
Yes. You think we didn't grow up fast?
You had to. You had no choice.
We were writing to these classmates. Remember I mentioned Tommy McWilliams?
Yeah.
He and I were writing to one another. And I remember one letter from him, getting down to the bottom of the page, the line was getting thinner and thinner. And this is before ballpoint pens. These were the days of the old-fashioned fountain pens.
Yeah.
He said, I better stop. The ink in my pen is freezing.
Oh, freezing. Oh, my goodness.
Yes. And he was wounded. He was wounded. He got a Purple Heart. Many, many Purple Hearts. Boys from other high schools, they died. In fact, the one I knew from Austin High School, he died in Korea. But anyway, that was maybe one of the reasons why some of us grew up so fast.
On the phone the other day about a UN cemetery that's in South Korea.
There's only one UN cemetery in the whole world, and that's in the city of Pusan. See, besides the United States, there were 16 other countries that sent men. As part of this, collective security. And you know what one of the countries was? Ethiopia.
Oh, listen to that.
Yeah, and early 68, I happened to be on the main street. It was on a Saturday morning. It was on the main street in Seoul, Korea. The route from the airport to the capital. And a motorcade came along. And guess who was in it? Haile Selassie. Haile Selassie. It was a cold January morning. It was drizzling. But they had on the right-hand side, the back seat of the limousine, the window was open, and there was this white gloved hand waving. So I saw the gloved hand of Haile Selassie. Years later, when we were having the international festivals here in Houston, one year it was about Ethiopia.
Oh, wonderful.
And there were a lot of Ethiopian exhibits and so forth, and I was talking to this one fellow, and I told him about this. And he said, would you like to shake the hand that shook the hand of Haile Selassie? And he told me that when he graduated from college, Haile Selassie had given them their diplomas and shook hands with them. Remember that 1 degree of separation?
There you go. That was my first thought. There you go.
Yeah, but anyway, every year in October there's a UN Day.
Okay.
Most people in this country don't even know there is a UN Day.
No, I've never heard of such a thing.
It's an international day.
Okay.
But in Korea, it's a national holiday. And every year, when I was there would be this ceremony at the UN cemetery where soldiers from these 17 countries were buried. And it's a very, very touching, very, very touching thing. I mean, they weren't fighting for their own country. They came as part of this collective security, and their bodies were there. Their bodies were there in that UN cemetery. And the school children would come, and they would put flowers on the graves of all these men.
That is
very,
fitting.
very, very, very touching.
That's fitting.
It's a very, very pleasant memory I have. But it's the only UN cemetery in the whole world. And you might say that in one way it's the greatest success of the UN.
For sure.
Well, when I got to Korea, there was only one country that still had troops there. It was from Thailand.
Okay.
I happened to be on a bus, and these 2.5 ton trucks passed by, and they were loaded with these troops from Thailand. So that's the background, and
that is a sound and thorough background. Thank you, Monsignor.
All right. I forgot to mention something too. MacArthur in Tokyo was telling the troops, go, 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 as I mentioned a while ago.
Yeah.
And the Chinese communists, they start making noises, They didn't like this army advancing on their border. And so they started making threats. And for that reason, Truman met with MacArthur on Wake Island. One of the main topics was, what do you think the Chinese might do? And MacArthur told him, oh, they're not going to do anything. If they do, they try to do something, so on and so on. He was very, very wrong. By that time when they met, there were already thousands, tens of thousands of Chinese troops who were already
ready to show. They were ready to show what they were going to do.
Well, you see, what we were doing, we were relying upon aerial reconnaissance. The Chinese weren't dumb. They were moving at night and sleeping in the daytime. So that's why we didn't know. And our 1st Marine Division people started taking Chinese prisoners, and they reported back to Tokyo, we're taking Chinese prisoners. And Tokyo's reply was, oh, those must be ethnic Chinese who are part of the North Korean army.
That's a bureaucracy acting like a bureaucracy.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why Truman lost confidence in MacArthur. Twice he had been very, very wrong. He had ignored the warnings before the invasion in June of 1950, and then he was wrong in his estimation of the intent of the Chinese and so forth.
That's right.
Well, I think this completes our background.
That's a good one. Thank you, Msgr. Will you close us with your wonderful blessing?
All right. Fear not, little flock. It has pleased your Father to give you the kingdom.
Amen. Thank you, Msgr. We'll see you soon, guys.